I just wanted to go over a thing that I meant to attach. They've separated them. They used to be the same document, What is Ethics, from the Macula Center, and then um, the framework for making an ethical decision. And now they've separated them out. And so I just wanted to address this since we didn't do this reading. I want to talk about it because it is really related to the goal um, in many ways. In particular, it has a really nice synopsis of the sort of different theoretical approaches to ethics. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to just go through this ethical decision making process with you that they've come up with. And the first thing you see here is recognize an ethical issue, right? So you recognize there's an ethical issue that needs to be dealt with, right? Could the decision or situation be damaging to someone or to some group? Just think of it in terms of COVID, right? Does the decision involve a choice between good and bad alternatives? Yes, it does. Or perhaps between two goods and between two bads? Yes, it does. In the case of COVID, what should I do? How should I act as an individual? How should we act as a community, right? Is the issue about more than what is legal and what is most efficient, right? And I think in both cases it is, right? It's legal to do all sorts of things, but that doesn't mean that you should do them in all cases. Like it's legal to go outside, go shopping, right? But the reason we're asking people to limit their movement is because we don't want to spread a deadly virus and perhaps kill people, right? Then their second step is get the facts. What do you know? What is factual information that you can show? Like people are dying from COVID in high numbers. People at the beginning of this outbreak said, "Oh, it's just like the flu. So many people die every year from the flu." This is much worse than the flu. We now know. The death instances are much higher than the yearly flu season. That's been proven now, unfortunately. And so the facts are, those are the facts that we're working with, right? Um, what individuals or groups have important stakes in the outcome? Are some concerns more important and why? So, you can see in that number four, uh, the issue right here, there's many different groups and individuals that have stakes in the outcome, but to be very simplistic, on the one hand, in the United States, we have the public health officials. On the other hand, we have the business community, right? So some people want to open things up much sooner than others. And the public health concern remains high, right? So right now we're going through that, problem of, well, if it's going to kill people, is that more important, right? Um, or if our economy is going to totally crash and we're going to end up in a really, scary situation, um, which, luckily the last time we got this close to the economy crashing, immediate action was taken. This was at the very beginning of the Obama administration, his first term in office, and he actually began working on it before he was even inaugurated, right? Because he had to. I mean, leaders all over the world had to start working on it immediately because it was an emergency, and we have an emergency now also with financial things, right? Um, and then you evaluate the different actions, and here are some just in really what do you call that? Distilled language, the different sort of theoretical approaches, the five most common theoretical approaches to ethics. So, in our goal in university studies, when we talk about, the theories, these are the theories that we're talking about, right? And you can read through those, but we're going to, well, actually, it's better to go through the distilled ones, and then I'll point on the next page to the little blurbs that you can read to see which one that you think is the best approach to take with an ethical concern. And you might take a different approach with different ethical concerns, right? Um, so you won't always necessarily pick the same one, even. Um, so, which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option best respects the rights of all who have a stake? Rights approach. Which option treats people equally and proportionally? The justice approach. Which option best serves the community as a whole and not just some members? The common good approach, which is, as you can see, kind of similar to utilitarian, but um, um, not quite as cut and dry as utilitarian. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be, or us, as Americans, as Oregonians, as Portlanders, what sort of people do we want to be? What sort of expression of our identity do we want people to understand through our actions, right? You make a decision, which option best addresses the situation. Um, yeah. And then they have this great question: if I told someone I respect or told a television audience which option I have chosen, what would they say? Right? So, how, when you're explaining yourself for an ethical issue, do you say, well, you know, we think that limiting people's movement during the COVID virus is the best option according to the utilitarian approach because it'll produce the most good and do the least harm, right? Do you feel you can explain that, right? And you could go through all of them and give some sort of um, idea about why that approach works, right? And then you, of course, reflect on it, right? Okay, so now I'm going to go to page 2 here. Here we go. And you can see we talked a little bit about this part of what is ethics last time. Um, Ethics is a shared standards of behaviors and tells us what we ought to do, right? Ethics is not feelings. We talked about this last time. What is ethics? But here is a little bit further articulated the 5 sources of ethical standards that are most common in the West, I should say, right? Um, this isn't necessarily true in East Asia or Africa or other places in the world, or it may take a different form in those places. But, you know, um, these are very Western ideas. And you can see here, like the Greek philosophers, right? I mean, we're going back to the bedrock of our civilization, right? With the common good approach. This is something that Aristotle and Plato argued for, right? And also virtue. That was very big with the Greeks, too. Um, and the rights approach really comes into play with the revolutions, the French Revolution, our own revolution after that. You know, the idea that the revolutions uh, began to bring in this idea of all men are created equal. Before that, like in Greek times, they didn't believe that all men are created equal, right? Um, Certainly not. Although they had the first democracy, the democracy part of it, the people that were part of the demos, or they were not talking about everybody in Greek society because there were slaves and there were low class people that were not part of that democracy, right? And theoretically, in our own democracy, in America in particular, everybody's supposed to have the same rights. Now, as we know from the civil rights movement, which has still not found its total um, resolution in our country, we don't treat everybody the same. Whether we have an ideal where all men are created equal, and by the way, it's men, not women, right, too. We haven't quite gotten to the point where we live up to our own ideal of a rights approach, right? So anyway, and then they have putting together approaches. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you can read this. I just wanted to make sure that I spent a little time on this very succinct but very helpful um, part of the reading that was not attached. As I said, until recently they used to be all one document, but here they've taken them out, and the part that you read was very brief and didn't include some of this really helpful information, especially like these five different approaches or theoretical approaches to ethical decision making. And, you know, we'll come back to these again and again throughout the term. I mean, when we talk about climate change, um, right, there's, for example, when you think this thing about ethics is not following the law, when you think about recycling, yes, the our jurisdiction, our city of Portland, our state of Oregon is a leader in recycling, but there's not cops that come around and fine you and say you're breaking the law if you're not recycling, right? It's more, this is, we're providing an opportunity for you to do something for the environment, and here's the recycling stuff, and here's what you should do. Should, right? Not must. The law is that all recycling, should be available to citizens, and that the jurisdiction that you're in, the city, the state, should provide opportunities for you to do that easily, right? Whether you do it or not is another story. Um, and you're not breaking the law, so to speak, if you don't do it. It's just not very cool in the state of Oregon if you don't do it, right? Okay, so I wanted to point that out, and that's what this video is all about, just letting you get a little glimpse of the um, document here, which I have posted in week 3 for you to take a look at. And as you're doing your group work project and writing your eloquent letter later in the term, which we'll talk about, um, you can use this document to sort of inform some of your writing. Okay, that's all I have for this video.